What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Ghostbuster Dad. In today's video we are going to be doing part 2 of Ghostbusters, the original novelizations of Ghostbusters 1 and 2. So without further ado, let's start chapter 2.
2. There are worse occupations in this world than feeling a woman's pulse. Lawrence Stern. Dr. Peter Venkman loved his work. He often said it to himself in precisely those words. I love my work. I'm not always quite sure what it is, but I do love it. I love getting up in the morning. I love coming down to my lab in the basement of Weaver Hall. And I love getting paid by Columbia University for doing whatever it is that I do. In fact, he often considered that a large part of what he did, perhaps the major part, consisted of just that, the search for identity, for purpose, for the meaning of just what it was that he did do. God, I love psychology. It's so wonderfully formless. You can get away with anything. He smiled warmly at his two subjects. Scott, Jennifer, are we ready? Jennifer favored him with a coy look and a quick anxious breath that made her breast rise and fall. She was convinced that Peter Venkman was a genius, or she soon would be. God, I love teaching, Venkman decided. He turned to Scott. Okay, partner. Scott Dickinson nodded nervously, his mouth pumping away on a quid of gum. He smiled crookedly at Jennifer, who froze him right out. Venkman pulled a card out of the Zener deck and held it up. All right, what is it? Scott set his jaw and concentrated, but Venkman could tell that part of his attention was on the copper cuff strapped to his wrist, its wires running to the control box on Venkman's side of the table. A square. Good guess, Venkman replied, but no. He turned the card over. It was a star. Nice try. He pushed a button, sending a mild shock through the boy. Dickinson twitched, but smiled gamely. The next card was a circle. Okay, Jennifer. Just clear your mind and tell me what you see. She did, chewing on one adorable finger. Is it a star? It is a star. That's great. You're very good, Venkman said enthusiastically, burying the card in the deck and extracting another. A diamond. Scott. Scott rubbed his wrist nervously. Circle. Close, but definitely wrong. This time Scott gave a little whimper. Venkman ran through a few more cards, letting Scott get only one right, watching the boy's growing impatience, his fear of the electric punishment. He even inched the current up a little. The monkeys had been able to take it, it shouldn't have any effect on a sophomore business major. And if it did, who would notice? Besides, it was time to wind up this phase anyway. Ready. What is it? Jennifer licked her lips excitedly. Figure 8. Venkman buried the triangle. Incredible. That's 5 for 5. You're not cheating on me, are you? No, doctor. They're just coming to me. Well, you're doing just great. Keep it up. I have faith in you. He considered stroking her leg under the table with his foot, see how she'd react, then rejected it. Might get Scott's leg by mistake. He smiled thinly at the young man. Scott Dickinson's own smile had slipped a few notches since they'd started. He let out a noisy breath, his tongue flapping on his uppers, and sniffed loudly. Nervous. Yes. I don't like this. Hey, you'll be fine. Only 75 more to go. What's this one? Wavy lines. 2 wavy lines. No, you don't. Venkman buried the card. Sorry. This just isn't your day. This time the kid's knees came up against the table and his gum popped out and skittered across the floor. Hey. I'm getting real tired of this. You volunteered, didn't you? Aren't we paying you for this? Yeah, but I didn't know you were going to be giving me electric shocks. What are you trying to prove? Venkman shrugged softly. I'm studying the effects of negative reinforcement on ESP ability. Dickinson leaned across the table and pulled off the electric cuff. I'll tell you the effect. It bugs me. Then my theory is correct. Your theory is garbage. Keep the $5. I've had it. He slammed the door hard enough to rattle the glass, leaving Venkman and Jennifer alone in the lab. Venkman shook his head sadly. That's the kind of ignorant reaction you're going to have to expect, Jennifer, from people jealous of your ability. Jennifer smiled bravely. Do you think I have it, drive? Venkman. Venkman jumped as something touched his ankle. Her foot. He favored her with his shyest, most boyish smile. Please, Peter. Okay, Peter. He leaned forward across the table and took her hands in his. Definitely. I think you may be a very gifted telepath. At that moment his arm came down on the button, sending a soft jolt through both of them. Jennifer jumped back, her sharp breath once again lifting her breasts. Ah, the wonders of modem science. Suddenly the door to the lab flew open and Ray Stantz hurried in. He didn't bother to close the door behind him, just ran to the storage bins and began pulling out equipment. Venkman noticed that someone had once again defaced the door. Written in red, in what was supposed to pass for blood, no doubt, were the words VENKMANN burn in hell. His name had been misspelled. He waited a moment, then sighed. Ray. Excuse me, Ray. Yeah, Peter. Ray, I'm trying to have a session here. Stantz pulled his head out of the parts bin, his eyes wide and wild with excitement. Sorry, you'll have to drop everything. We got one. Jennifer was looking at Stantz as if he had just fallen off the surface of the moon. Good thing he didn't bring Egan, Venkman thought. He touched her hand. Excuse me for a minute. Stantz was plugging battery grid analyzers together when Venkman grabbed him by the arm. Ray, I'm right in the middle of something here. Can you come back in an hour? Stantz put a finger to his lips, then dragged him back behind the bins. Ray, I've never seen you like this. Peter, at 1:40 this afternoon at the main branch of the New York Public Library on 5th Avenue, 10 people witnessed a free-roaming, vaporous, full-torso apparition. It blew books off shelves at 20 feet away, and scared the socks off some poor librarian. Venkman thought of beautiful Jennifer, and weighed the thought of her against the clear call of scientific exploration. That's great, Ray. I think you should get right down there and check it out. Let me know what happens. Stantz handed him a valence meter and slipped the strap of a heavy-duty tape recorder over his head. No, Peter. This is for real. Spengler went down there and took some PKE readings. Right off the scale. Buried the needle. We're close this time, I can feel it. So can I, Venkman sighed, but it looks like I'm not going to feel it now. Okay, just give me a second here. And take this stuff. He slipped up behind the girl, placed a hand on each shoulder, and smiled sadly. She looked up at him as if, oh, the things I do for science. I have to leave now, but if you've got the time I'd like you to come back this evening and do some more work with me, say. 8 o'clock. Venkman laughed delightedly. I was just going to say 8. You're fantastic. Until then. Fantastic. The cab let them off in front of the library. Venkman made sure that Stantz paid the driver, then helped him bundle his equipment out onto the sidewalk. Help me carry this. Sure, Ray. Venkman picked up a plasmatometer about the size of an electric razor. You got the rest of that? There's something happening, Peter, I'm sure of it, Stantz said, struggling to his feet with a double armful of gear. The tape recorder around his neck made him look like a pack animal. Spengler and I have charted every psychic occurrence in the tri-state area for the past 2 years. The graph we came up with definitely points to something big. Ray, as your friend, I have to tell you that I think you've really gone around the bend on this ghost stuff. You've been running your butt off for 2 years, checking out every waterhead in the 5 boroughs who thinks he's had an experience. And what have you seen? What do you mean by seen? As in, seen. You know, looked at with your eyes. Well, I was, once at an unexplained multiple high-altitude rockfall. I've heard about the rockfall, Ray. I think you've been spending too much time with Egan. Peter Venkman was not the first person to have uttered those words. Throughout his childhood, in the quiet suburbs of Cleveland, Egan Spengler had provoked that reaction more than once. I think you've been spending too much time with Egan. While his friends were indulging in the delights of childhood, cutting school, shoplifting, minor vandalism, Egan Spengler was making a nuisance of himself at the public library, ordering books that the librarians had neither heard of, nor liked the sound of. The mysteries of latent abnormality. Electrical applications of the psychosexual drive. Your friend the fungus. Astral projections as an untapped power source. The Necronomicon. While his friends were playing pranks and throwing firecrackers, Egan was developing a compact new explosive made of guncotton and chicken dung. He wrapped a fist-sized lump of the stuff in aluminum foil, set it atop a waist-high erector-set tower in a vacant lot, and surrounded it with 3 concentric rings of plasticville houses stolen from his brother's Lionel train layout. Then he ran wires to a hand-crank generator and, retiring to a makeshift bunker he'd built, set the thing off. He'd been intending only to knock down the houses, but both houses and tower were vaporized, and he'd broken every window in a 3-block radius. I think you've been spending too much time with Egan. While his friends were going out on dates and fumbling around in each other's underwear, Egan was observing their mating rituals through binoculars and taking notes. Then, based on a complex formula he had worked out involving ambient temperature, phases of the moon, tidal cycles for Lake Erie, and a dozen other factors, he calculated the exact number of cases of venereal disease that would be reported over the next 3 months, and posted his findings on the high school bulletin board. If I catch you around that Spengler kid, you've had it. Somehow Egan survived to enter college, then grad school, then the real world, but it never quite affected him. He was always happier in the company of other mavericks like Stantz and Venkman than with the educators and businessmen with whom he was eventually forced to deal. He was always more at home with the arcane, the bizarre, the scientifically disreputable. Today he was at home with a table. Venkman and Stantz found him sitting beneath a heavy oak reading table in the library's Astor Hall, listening to the wooden underside with stereo headphones connected to a stethoscope. As usual, there was a large area around Egan totally devoid of people, and several patrons were peering warily at him from behind their books and newspapers. Even in New York, few people listened to tables. Venkman motioned to Stantz to hand him the heavy copy of Tobin's Spirit Guide, then rapped softly on the table. Egan froze, instantly alert, his wild eyes swinging from side to side. Oh boy, Venkman thought, this is wonderful. Any credibility we might have established with these people was officially shot down. He rapped his knuckles on the table again. Egan. Egan adjusted the control on his headset and peered closely at the table bottom, the rims of his glasses scraping the wood. Venkman slammed the Spirit Guide down on the top. GNNAAAUUUHHHH. Egan, come out of there. Egan Spengler adjusted his glasses and goggled up at Venkman. Oh, you're here. What have you got, Egan? Spengler clambered to his feet. This is big, Peter. This is very big. There's definitely something here. Venkman rubbed his temples. The day had started so well. Egan, somehow this reminds me of the time you tried to drill a hole in your head. Do you remember that? That would have worked. Spengler's explanation was cut short by the arrival of an unhappy-looking man in a rumpled suit. Venkman shook his offered hand. Hello, I'm Roger Delacourt, head librarian. Are you the men from the university? Yes, Venkman replied, all business. I'm Drive. Venkman and this is Dr. Stantz. You've met Drive. Spengler. Delacourt nodded. Thank you so much for coming. I'd appreciate it if we could take care of this quickly and quietly. You know. I understand, Venkman said soothingly. Now, if we could see the woman who first witnessed the apparition. Certainly. You stay here and keep tabs on it, Egan, Venkman suggested. No sense in shocking this poor woman twice in one day. Alice Melvin had been made comfortable, which is to say that she had been stretched full length on the couch in Delacourt's office and was being tended by several of her colleagues. However, she seemed far from relaxed. Her body was stiff and severe, and little tremors passed through her limbs. Delacourt shooed the other women away and made introductions. While the woman related her experience with the card catalog and the books, Stantz grew increasingly excited, until Venkman made him sit down, shut up, and take readings. Ray Stantz subsided behind the peeps and clicks of his apparatus. While he directed probes and counters at the librarian, Delacourt, and various inanimate objects in the office, Venkman tried to make some sense of the woman's story, but it all boiled down to the fact that they would have to go into the stacks and look for the blasted thing. The woman didn't look like a loony, but appearances can be deceiving. Spengler hadn't seemed that crazy on first meeting either, and Stantz usually fooled most people, but nowadays you couldn't tell. He decided to steer the questions around to credibility. Did the thing have 2 arms and legs, or what? Alice Melvin remained staring at the ceiling. I don't remember seeing any legs, but it definitely had arms because it reached for me. Arms. Great. I can't wait to get a look at this thing. Cool it, Ray. Venkman set down his pad and pencil. He smiled reassuringly. All right, Miss Melvin. Have you, or has any member of your family, ever been diagnosed as schizophrenic or mentally incompetent? Well, my uncle thought he was street. Jerome. Stance and Delacourt looked at each other. Venkman smiled again. I'd call that a big, yes. Do you yourself habitually use drugs, stimulants, or alcohol? No, Alice Melvin replied shakily. I thought not. And one last thing. Are you currently menstruating? Delacourt turned several shades of red. What's that got to do with it, drive? Venkman. Back off, man. I'm a scientist. Delacourt, outraged, turned to Stance for support, but he only nodded sagely and ran an ionization meter up and down the man's tie. Alice Melvin did not seem offended. It's all right, Mr. Delacourt. He is a doctor. Well, I never. Just answer the question, miss. But Venkman got no answer, for at that moment the door flew open and Spengler raced in. Hurry. It's moving. The two followed Spengler down the darkened corridors leading into the stacks, as only Spengler could make sense of his complicated, primitive equipment. Every so often he would stop, observe the pattern of blinking lights on the plasmatometer, then indicate a new direction. Stance was as excited as a kid with an armful of new toys, but for Venkman the thrill was rapidly wearing thin. You sure you know where you're going, Egan? Shish. They reached a spiral iron staircase and tiptoed down into the dimly lit basement. Corridors stretched away in all directions, flanked by steel shelving covered with books. In the distance some piece of machinery, a water pump most likely, was softly humming. Spengler stopped short. My God, look. The floor was covered with books and catalog cards, tumbled and strewn in all directions. An overturned cart blocked one aisle. Venkman experienced a sudden chill. Loonies I can ignore, but there are books all over the floor. Those are real. Spengler pocketed the plasmatometer and held up a black teardrop-shaped device with wings. He called in an horoscope. Venkman thought it looked like it had come from one of those sex places on 42nd Street, but the lights on the thing's upper surface immediately began to blink. Spengler let out a thrilled squeal. Through here. Careful. They worked their way slowly toward the catalog cabinets, the piles of dewy cards getting thicker on the floor. Venkman tried not to think about the possibility that they'd actually found one this time. That they were way in over their heads. Stance passed him a plastic petri dish. What's that for? Specimens. Specimens. He considered trying to fold a file card into it, then gave up and slipped the dish into his pocket. Spengler halted and raised one hand. Will you look at that? What? The three crowded together and peered at the card files. The file drawers were in all manner of disarray, some in, some out, some on the floor, which was knee-deep in file cards and paste. No, some sort of glue-like substance. It was everywhere, bubbling and oozing in streams from the drawers, speckling the books, dropping in stringy blobs from the ceiling. Venkman fumbled the petri dish from his pocket, then stopped, not sure how to go about it. Stance and Spengler were huddled together, whispering. Incredible, a plasma flow of this magnitude. Hasn't been anything like it since the Watertown pus eruption in 1910. This is making me very excited. This is making me very sick, Venkman said to himself. He turned the petri dish sideways and managed to capture a quantity of the discharge, then snapped the top on it. It still got all over his hands. Just what I need, cosmic boogers. Come on, Peter. Venkman tried to wipe his hands off on the cabinet, then on the remaining books, finally settling for the tail of Ray's sport coat. He caught up with Spengler at the end of the corridor and passed him the specimen. Here, Egan. Your mucus. But Egan was staring at an 8-foot pile of books standing against one wall. They teetered gently but did not topple. Again Stance and Spengler went into a huddle. What do you make of that? Classic. Symmetrical book stacking. Like the Library of Alexandria incident. Sure, Venkman added. It's obvious. No human being stacks books like that. He grabbed Spengler by the arm. The ghost, Egan. Where is it? Right. He held up the horoscope. This way. Halfway down the passageway a book jumped off the shelf and flew at Venkman. He caught it neatly. It was a copy of The Shining. Real nice. A few steps later the hair went up on the back of his neck. Spengler turned and held up the little detector, its bat wings now extended outward, their miniature bulbs blinking rapidly. The device was emitting a low hum. Spengler pointed wordlessly. Stantz and Venkman nodded and pointed back. Their meaning was clear. You go first. Swallowing a lump the size of his fist, Spengler leaned out and peeked around the corner. A second later he slipped back and nodded. It's here. What is it? Stantz asked. What do you think it is? It's a ghost. See for yourself. The three tiptoed quietly into the hallway and looked on in amazement. There, floating about 4 feet off the floor between the stacks, was a glowing ethereal presence, a swirl of colored lights bobbing among the books. Stantz attempted to raise yet another instrument, but Venkman slapped it down. No sudden moves, he whispered, not knowing if the ghost even registered their presence, but unwilling to take chances. Spengler slowly closed his gaping mouth. Look. It's forming. The light swirled in tighter and began to take on a definite shape, that of a somewhat portly torso, the essence still vaporous where the arms, legs, and head should be. The lines of 2 large, sagging breasts began to emerge. What is it? Whispered Stantz. Venkman shrugged. Whatever it was hardly threatening in this state. It looks like a pair of breasts and a pot belly. Stantz very slowly raised his camera and began to take infrared photos. Spengler toyed with the oroscope. A head and arms began to take shape. It's a woman, Spengler gasped. It was. The apparition had taken on the form of a matronly, somewhat elderly woman, complete with a bun of silver-green hair and a dress of the style popular around the turn of the century. She was reading a book. Venkman noticed that there were still no legs connecting the phantasm to the floor, but he wasn't in the mood to quibble about it. This was pretty amazing. Nice goin', Egan, he whispered. Stantz snapped another picture, then moved to switch cameras. Their subject had still taken no notice of them. I told you it was real. Yes, you did, Ray. So, what do we do now? Stantz shrugged. I don't know. Talk to it. Venkman nodded. Why not? He took a step forward, the other two moving in behind him. The phantom still hovered silently in the air. What do I say? Anything. Just make contact, Stantz replied, snapping pictures as fast as he could work the camera. Venkman squared his shoulders, took a deep breath, and cleared his throat. Nothing. Hello. I'm Peter. This time she turned in his general direction and seemed to look right through him. Where are you from, originally? The apparition put a finger to its lips and mimed a shushing sound, then went back to its spectral book. Ray, the usual thing isn't working. Think of something else. Okay, Stantz whispered. I got it. I know what to do. Stay close to me. I have a plan. Stantz edged forward, shifting from foot to foot, the others keeping close behind him. Venkman's mouth was dry. He realized that he hadn't been so frightened since he was a kid. Spengler's Adam's apple bobbed up and down. Stantz paused when they were barely 3 feet from the woman. Okay, now everybody do exactly as I say. Ready? Venkman and Spengler nodded. Stantz tensed to spring. Okay, get her. He flew forward, his arms reaching around the ghost. She was, of course, not there, and Ray Stantz hit the bookcase, bounded back, and went down on top of Venkman and Spengler, who had run into each other. The ghost reformed a few feet away and exploded upward and outward in a rush of air into the form of a hideous demon, claws outstretched, coming toward them. They stumbled back, smelling the horrible breath of the thing, feeling the heat as it screamed forth a single word. Quiet. On the steps out front, Harlan Beaujay and Robert Learned Coombs were getting ready to move along. The day was waning and they had lost the sun, the drop in temperature portending the approach of winter's chill. Beaujay shook himself loose from his perch and staggered up, a day of inactivity and half a bottle of wine having taken their toll, when the front doors of the library flew open and 3 men came tearing out, pursued by the chief librarian, Delacourt. Beaujay knew who he was because the man had hassled him more than once, but something had kept him busy this day because Beaujay and Coombs had remained unmolested. Beaujay drew back behind the stone lion to listen as Delacourt caught one of the men by an arm. Did you see? What was it? He cried, but the other man broke free, shook his head, and ran, calling over his shoulder, "We'll get back to you." After a moment Delacourt headed back into the library, looking very much like a man summoned to witness an execution. Perhaps his own. Beaujay shook his head. Curious town, he thought, and getting curiouser by the moment. Then something caught his eye and he moved out to see what it was. A small curved and rounded black object on which lights flashed. He picked it up carefully. It had obviously been dropped by one of the running men. He listened, for it made a humming sound, but he could find no button, switch, or trigger. Very strange. Coombs moved up to his shoulder to look at the artifact. "Whatcha got there, Harlan?" "I honestly do not know, my friend. A cunning device of some kind. A mechanism, an artifact, a construction. Do you think we can get anything for it?" Bojay smiled. "At least a bottle of wine." 3.
Okay, so that was very interesting, considering the fact that that was a little different than what we've seen in the movie. Um, One thing that really bugs me is that it was saying Egan instead of Egon. But the part with the whole Jennifer situation, wow. Okay, that was just very weird to me, I guess. Um, but for Venkman, I can definitely see it actually happening. Because Peter Venkman is quite the man, the woman pleaser type of person, but not being able to actually see that scene, it was definitely very weird hearing it in the book. But we all know how books are, and it goes into way more detail. But yeah, that was very detailed of what might have happened if Ray wouldn't have walked in, for sure. But the library part, um, that was very interesting to me as well. Um, a lot of different stuff was said. And in the movie, Ray never fell into a bookcase as they walked around its corner. He said, "All right, stay behind me. Get her." And that's when Eleanor turned a demonic presence and scared them away. So that was very interesting to hear that side of the story as well. But yeah, this book is very interesting, and I cannot wait to see what happens next. So if you guys would like to experience that with me, definitely subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and I am on my way to 1,000 subscribers, so please help me make my goal. It is my goal by the end of this year, so please help me get there. Please. But join me as we go to chapter 3, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.